So that means that we should keep our curse words to a minimum.
Oh, come on.
Yes, because we're streaming, and this is the first one that we've tried at Orlando Python that isn't using a Google Hangout, so anyone watching it isn't going to appear in the little box on the corner. Yes. It's up here. I know the stream isn't showing this, but it's kind of nice. It's nostalgic because there's only I can't math. As far as you know, there's 600 people here. That's just off by a factor of something, and I'll let you figure it out.
And the fire department will be here any second for violating code.
It's for posterity. I'm sure there will be some AI bot that watches this.
Somewhere we'll get on a one of the services that surface Sub-Zero view YouTube videos. Anyway, we're gonna have two quick coding presentations. We have Mike Fox here who's going to demonstrate adding how to make your apps more accessible, and I will let him describe his amazing presentation here because there's more to it than meets the eye.
Thanks. Well, like it says, yo, what's up, Orlando Python? So before we get started, quick question for you guys. Does anyone here do web stuff like Flask or Bottle, Django?
I just know your walk that took approximately 17 minutes long walk.
Yeah.
Now I gotta take a journey back to get my car. It's like 3 miles that way.
Don't worry, you didn't miss a thing.
Nope.
How y'all doing?
We are just getting started. So anyone here do, like I said, any of those web-based things, Django, Flask, Bottle, gotta be a few others I'm missing. Well, if you do, then this is the presentation for you because what I'm going to be talking about is, yes, of course, an intro to accessibility, also an intro to nw.js. It's the platform that I've used to develop this presentation, and also the platform we use at work to make our programs more accessible. And of course, got to have some code demos in there. And we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. So, sorry, you're about to see some assistive technology in action here to find this. Here we go. So, accessibility, what's that? Hopefully that's not your first thought. Otherwise, it'd be, what's this made up about anyway? So the Wikipedia definition is on the screen. What's interesting about it is most people think accessibility, they think blind and low vision people, and they think custom versions of the software just for them. But it's actually a lot more general than that. Can a person with a disability use or access your program? So this includes all disability groups, so not just blind or visually impaired, even though that's the group I work with, obviously, but people who are deaf. There are even standards out there about how frequently a program flashes because of people who have seizures and other things going on. I mean, it's really in depth. There's a lot of stuff that accessibility as a whole covers. So, I'm sorry, folks. How do blind people use the computer anyway? Well, you just saw part of it. Screen magnifiers will zoom in on an area of the screen. This is great if you're like me, you have some vision, and your distance vision is just not there yet, or, really anyone who can't see the screen as well. On Windows, there's a built-in magnifier, which is what you just saw. There are also software vendors that sell things, Zoom Text, Magic, some of the other names in the market. So screen magnification is pretty straightforward. Looking at what's here, you can see I can really, yeah, if you can't read that, then you probably need to go to the next solution, and that is screen readers. Now, screen readers are awesome. Screen readers make it possible for totally blind people to use the computer. I have a friend who is a blind C++ developer. He could probably code circles around me in that language because I'm not that great at C++ yet. I have a friend who's done multiple Drupal websites because Drupal is also a very accessible platform. And these folks can't see at all. So I'm going to demonstrate this real briefly for you. Sorry I have the default voice on the screen reader. The screen reader is called NVDA, that's Non-Visual Desktop Access. It's an open source, free screen reader. It's actually competing now with a lot of the bigger name screen readers out there. And ironically, it's written in Python. So I'm going to fire that up.
Orlando Python presentation window. Orlando Python presentation document.
So it told me the window I was in. It is seeing this as a web page. So it said Orlando Python presentation document. Now, I can use the arrow keys to go from one thing to the next.
Button next. Button back. Let me demo those for you for just a minute. List with 2 items, 2 screen readers.
So obviously, at this point, it had me at the bottom because I was on the next button. But it told me that as I'm using up and down arrow keys, it is telling me what is above or below it in the HTML code. Which is interesting because if you look at it from a visual perspective, it's not just vertical. Off to the left at the bottom corner, you have a back button. On the bottom right corner, you have a next button. Well, to a screen reader user, that doesn't really mean anything. If I were to hit down arrow a few times.
Outer list, let me demo those for you for just a minute. Button back. Button next.
So the back button is below the next button. Sorry, other way around. What's great about the web in this context is screen readers have tools that only apply to surfing the web. So normally, in a desktop application, you can use the arrow keys, you can use tab and shift tab, and all that works here.
Back button. Next button.
Same as before. But you can also use, for example, B to go to the next button, or Shift B to go to the previous button, H for headings, X for checkboxes, and the list goes on and on and on and on. With all these really great navigation tools that make a web page accessible almost out of the box. So here's that Shift B,
Back button.
Shift H.
How do blind people use the computer? Heading level 2. So wait, heading level 1.
So here I can jump to the next heading, the previous heading. I want to go just down to the next button real quick.
Back button, next button. Exit NVDA dialog.
So I'm sure you can imagine if that is your only input as to what's on the screen, it can be kind of tricky. And one thing I actually should have gone back to here real quick is, so for screen readers, the mouse is pretty much not a thing. That is changing because NVDA will speak what's under the mouse. Some commercial screen readers are slowly catching up to the open source guys. And also because of touch screens, now not just a laptop, it's a tablet or a phone, and you can just touch it the same way a mouse user would click on something. Also, for the magnification users, when we're reading text like I was doing, that's not really a problem. But if you've got message boxes popping up, or your antivirus is trying to tell you something, that can be a pain because those messages go unnoticed. I can't tell you how many times I was watching Netflix or, doing YouTube, pretty much anything video. I'd have it zoomed out, and then down in the lower right-hand corner, I'd see some updates trying to run. I hit my magnifier shortcut, and it's gone.
All right, I don't know if you established a method of handling questions, so I'm sorry about that.
Sure, no
Are you
problem.
saying that there's an opportunity for AI in screen magnifying and screen reading?
Absolutely. I think that's something that I would really like to see more of, and I think we're going to see more of as time goes on.
This is kind of a corporate / government policy question, but do you think that software like that would end up being government mandated as part of the accessibility packages?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do not work for a government agency, so and if I could, I probably could not confirm or deny what would happen there. My opinion is I'd like to see it happen. I don't know if it will, but it's growing. Part of the problem on Windows compared to other platforms is it's all pretty open. I don't see any government saying you must have NVDA on there when there are at least 3 or 4 other screen readers that I know of that are commercial, that are, now I'm sure the right company with the right connections, you never know, but on the other hand, on the iPhone, it's voiceover. I had not planned to do this, but since we're talking platforms, this is what it sounds like on the iPhone. And granted, it's a lot faster on my phone because I didn't plan to do this, but
88% battery power. Status bar item. 7:30 p.m.
so on the iPhone, that's pretty much all it is. It's voiceover, period, because that is the operating system's default screen reader.
7:30 p.m.
Okay.
Accessibility alert. Accessibility shortcuts. Selected. Voiceover off.
Another thing I like about the iPhone, you can turn it off. So Windows is kind of open-ended, so I don't necessarily see that happening anytime soon. They're working on Narrator, but Narrator does not compare to NVDA yet. It does not compare to some of the other big names out there yet. I hope it does, because then there really will be no need for these competing commercial products, because it'll all just be there, like on the iPhone. Sorry, that's kind of a non-answer, but
Well, the answer
It's,
I had. So. Thank you.
so anyway, sorry guys, sometimes finding that mouse cursor, it's hard without turning on the magnifier. So when it comes to GUIs, the problem is some GUI frameworks were not, and I mean not, designed with accessibility in mind. Some of them, in an attempt to be cross-platform, they used a drawing API to reinvent the button, rather than have each platform's native button element, which I know is kind of a mess to work with. I mean, you look at Java's Swing, they kind of missed the boat on that one big time. But at the same time, when the alternative is to draw your own button however you want it, that's great for people who can click and people who can see it, but that thing is an image. There is no screen there is no text that is recognizable to the screen reader. Even if in your code you have draw text, well, it's still basically a drawing. You're telling it to put these pixels on the screen in an order that looks like text. A screen reader won't know that it's text, and a screen reader won't know that it's a button. You also run into trouble anytime you got anything running remotely through Citrix, other programs like that really all you get is an image. And anytime you have a GUI that does not send its information to the OS's accessibility API, it's just not going to work. A screen reader user might be able to get some things. There are all kinds of, I haven't even scratched the surface of what's available in that screen reader. There are shortcuts for everything, and that's just one screen reader out of many. So there are opportunities there for some things to be read, but it's rare. And this is a common problem. It's not just Java, like I picked on Java earlier. It's not just Python. Python has so many GUI frameworks, I don't even know which ones are and are not accessible. That could be a whole other presentation. But really, I've even seen .NET programs that were done that way. They used system.drawing where they should have used system.windows.forms. But that's getting a little off topic. So the problem is pretty obvious. And if I had had more advanced time, I would have liked to kind of demo what an inaccessible program looks like. But since you've already heard the screen reader, I'm sure you can imagine that for yourself. But more importantly, what I want to focus on here is the solution. So if you were at the last ODevs meetup, you saw my lightning talk on nw.js. NW used to be called Node WebKit. Basically, they took Node and Chromium, which is the open source version or component of Chrome, combined it together into one program so that you're not actually firing up a web server, but you have a web GUI that, you're building your GUI with web technologies. For example, if you're doing anything web-based, you're going to use HTML, JavaScript, CSS, maybe TypeScript or Elm. You're probably using some framework, like I use Dojo a lot. And that's cool. But for desktop apps, shoot. TK-Inter, PyQt, WX widgets, the list goes on and on and on and on. Why not just use what you know from web? And that's exactly what this allows you to do. So I have here a very long list of examples of why you would want to use NW.js. I'll just go over a few. One, interestingly enough, it is cross-platform. Like I said earlier, sometimes GUI frameworks to be cross-platform, they'll break accessibility. Well, this works on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. Does not currently do mobile, which kind of stinks, because then I would be doing Android and iOS apps like crazy. But it allows you to call node functions directly from the DOM. It doesn't come with some of those restrictions that you get from actually running in a browser. JavaScript, for obvious reasons, cannot access local files. There's some things you just can't do from, in a web app. And I think to me, the main reason that I would use this, again, I do a lot of web stuff at work. I know HTML JavaScript, CSS, and so on. To me, it makes more sense to do that than to spend all the time learning another framework that I'm really going to use just when I'm doing Python stuff. This will work with C#, it'll work with C++, it will work with, well, obviously Python, because we'll be getting into that in a sec. And I know because I've actually tried it with all of them. So, I'm sorry, I have to crank up my notification here. Oh, yeah. So, obviously, this is Orlando JavaScript user group. OJUG, OJSUG. But we came to talk about accessibility, so I wanted to make sure we covered accessibility. So, when writing HTML, whether it's a web app, whether it's using NW, whether it's using Electron, which is another variant of something similar to NW, using native elements is a huge help. So, for example, I was on PizzaHut.com. Pizza Hut had this checkbox graphic that wasn't really a checkbox. Visual users knew if I click on this thing, it's going to change to look like a checkbox. But with my screen reader, it was a graphic. And it was a graphic with no label. So it defaulted to the name of the image, which was something like, it would spoke link graphic img001.png. What does that tell the user? That it's a pointless graphic that does nothing. So where in this case, just using a checkbox would have helped a lot. Same goes for just about every other element out there, a button, a text box. And unfortunately, HTML, one thing it has become is sort of the do-it-yourselfer widget language. Everything's a div. Everything's a, part of some other thing that is just there because JavaScript is going to make it look a certain way. And if you really need to do that, that's the second point. There's a JavaScript API out there called ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And ARIA will basically, you can use it to tell screen readers what an object is supposed to be. For example, in this slideshow, I have buttons at the bottom. They're graphics, but I used ARIA to tell NVDA, this is a button. That's why I was able to press B for button and go to those even though they weren't technically buttons. So ARIA is a huge component of web accessibility. I definitely recommend that you check it out. Or on the other hand, if you're not into any of that stuff and you just want to use a framework, I got you covered too. One of my favorite frameworks, I use it at work, I even use it at home if the project's big enough, is the Dojo Toolkit, or just Dojo. Dojo comes with a ton of accessible widgets. They've actually made accessibility one of their main points. It's every bit as cool looking and every bit as stylable, if that's a word, as some of these other frameworks that are out there. In fact, we recently got a designer at work. This guy, he makes my stuff look 1,000 times better because I'm not a designer by any stretch of the imagination for obvious reasons. With Dojo, I don't have to worry about is the ARIA stuff set correctly, how will screen readers interpret this. They actually put in their documentation how to use the thing with a screen reader, what the known issues are. I really would like to go into it again sometime because Dojo is just fantastic. Uh, for example, they have menu bars, they have dialogues, they have a lot of stuff that HTML doesn't offer out of the box. Remember I was saying use native elements? Well, there is no native dialogue element yet. I mean, they're working on it. They do have a dialogue node now, but it doesn't actually force it to work like a dialogue. So that's probably an info overload because I'm sure even if you're doing web stuff, a lot of this might be new. So let's switch back to Python for a minute. Oop, and I switched a little too far. Because here's the thing. This presentation software that I used, I could have just done PowerPoint, but I wanted to get into some Python code. This was created with nw.js. So I could do it with, for example, right now this is a kiosk or full screen program. I could have had it windowed if I wanted to. But the bottom line is, Python is the language we're talking about here, and I wanted to share how you can use Python with NW.js to make accessible, awesome apps. So this first one, getSlide.py. Please excuse the magnification. I am going to need it here to follow along.
I think that's perfect because
I
we
think
always
I-
have people complain that they can't see the screen, and no worries this time.
Okay, cool. Just so you know, FYI, Windows equals. That's the shortcut to bringing this up, and then Windows escape when you're done. So, it's pretty rudimentary stuff here. I mean, I'm not getting into any real big data stuff or any deep learning. We are importing a couple libraries, argparse, text file. So from here, I'm setting up a couple of command line parameters. This getSlide script. I don't know why the was highlighted there. So the only real parameter for it is the number of the slide number. So once it gets that from the NW.js, we're going to try and open a text file with the name of that, with the number we just entered. So slide 0, slide 1, slide 2, and so on. And then print obviously prints it to standard output, which NW.js can then render on the page. So getSlide, pretty straightforward. Next one, and what's this pop up? Get total slides. Okay. And this one I have this comment just letting me, and probably you guys know too, the JavaScript code is actually checking to see what is the total number of slides before trying to advance. So if I had just clicked next 100 times, it would have gone to the last slide and stayed there, so it didn't crash the program. And that's really all this does. It counts the number of files. There we go. So yeah, it's just listing. It gets the list of files in that directory, and then outputs the total count. So those are both used to make the back and next button work. The last one is also connected to the back and next button, but it was more just for the heck of it, because I wanted to see what would happen if I threw in a native function there. Because this wind sound it's calling the play sound function. And that was the click sound that you heard with each button press. So we have here this sort of exchange of information from NWJS and Python. NW can call Python scripts passing in command line parameters. Python can return HTML. It could even return JavaScript if you wanted, but that's just crazy. So if you wanted to, I mean, I could see, for example, I've been real heavy into computer vision lately. If I wanted to do some image processing and have maybe an HTML upload box and then an image that would display before and after, all kinds of stuff you could do with this. If you wanted a database, obviously SQLite 3, basically anything Python can do, you can do with NW. So the advantage here is you can do, like I said, front end just like web. Back end is a bit different. You need to know how to run a program from Node, but that's like a quick Google. And then the rest is just the Python you know and love. On the JavaScript side, again, pretty straightforward stuff. We don't need all my code comments. Those will be on GitHub. So this function run, I'd really kind of like to stop the code part at this part, because from after this is kind of really the most relevant to what we're talking about here. In Node, they have a function require. We're requiring the child process module, and then basically we're passing in the name of the program or script, we're passing in the parameters, and then a callback function to this node function. And then I just have it, if there's an error, if something goes wrong, log it, otherwise run the callback. So it's a real thin wrapper around this node stuff, which I am far from a node expert, but this has been my favorite part of working with NW, because it doesn't matter if it's a Python script or an AutoHotkey script or a C# program or C++ program, whatever the case may be, you can use it with this framework. So, any questions?
Just out of curiosity, how do you see accessibility progressing in the future?
Wow. You totally got me on that one.
How would you like to see accessibility?
I can tell you how I would like to see it. I think with bots becoming such a big thing, our experience is going to be less and less about click this button, type this text in here, and more type or speak what you want it to do. I mean, you look at Alexa, Cortana, Siri, okay, Google, the list goes on and on and on and on. That, to me, just seems like the way technology in general is heading with AI. Like you mentioned AI earlier, you know. And AI can do pretty much whatever it's programmed, whatever you tell it to do. So there is very little of this trying to interact with a program. I really like to see things head more that way, simply because from a developer standpoint, we're just integrating with APIs. We spend all this time building GUIs when we really could just have people interact with an AI. And of course, AI is not perfect, and it shouldn't be the only anyway, but as it keeps getting bigger and better, I really would like to see this be the same for accessibility.
So you mentioned Alexa and things that are more voice operated. Do you think that as we move to technologies that are more voice operated, that presents more challenges in accessibility to deaf people?
Absolutely. Just looking at Siri, I can't tell you how many times I've just tried to get it to say, or I've tried to ask for directions, or ask what's the nearest Pizza Hut, Max Pizza, or whatever. And it'll say something like, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, or would you like me to search the web for XYZ? Now those will put it on the screen in text format for people who can see it. So I guess as long as they keep the visuals there, it really shouldn't be an issue. I think the only people who would really be hurt by it are the ones who are both blind and deaf. But frankly, I'm not sure how those folks even use the computer, because even a screen reader uses audio. So that is way beyond what I know of that particular disability. But that's a good question. I would not have thought of that. But I think if there's nothing else you guys get from this, the main thing is, let's keep these different people groups in mind as we develop our programs. Because whether you're doing Python with NW, or a web app, or some other language, whatever, you don't know who's going to want to be on there. I had a friend once who, pardon me, I had a friend once who really wanted to check out what was going on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, but he was asking, hey, do you know of any accessible Twitter clients? Like, go ahead. Now, Twitter's kind of a big, they should know better at their level. And I'm sure they have done something with it since then. But, if you have a great program, then someone with a disability is going to want to see it, or hear it, or whatever the case may be. And that's a long answer for a short question. Any others?
Do you know if the migration to certain JavaScript frameworks has caused additional problems for people with disabilities? You mentioned, so many divs now being a problem, and immediately React comes to mind for me, because React functions as div within div within div within div. That is by default, like, you can't get away from that in the way that it's structured. And so what I'm wondering is there something specific we should be telling people who are using frameworks that are like that, that they can do for accessibility while they're developing, or something that React could do in their open source code to take care of this problem? Because Facebook's the one that made it, and they're certainly a big enough company to worry about that. Right?
That was like my joke earlier. They should know better at their level. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, well, like the average programmer probably wouldn't think about a lot of this stuff, especially like somebody who's just trying to get started or start up something like that.
Yeah.
Do you see there being a value in a tool that would do like an accessibility check in order to go ahead and help remediate those problems before the problems?
That's a good question. There are tools to evaluate your website for accessibility. The one that I know of offhand is achecker.ca. But they are more after the fact, once the thing is built. What you're talking about sounds more like the kind of project I want to mess with after hours. Because there's really nothing like that out there yet. To get to the question of what would we suggest to a new programmer or the developers of a framework like React, that's where that ARIA stuff is huge. I'm going to take another unplanned detour here. One nice feature of NW, if you are in SDK mode, you can do inspect like you would do in Chrome. So I just did inspect element on the button. So like I said, the button is really an image element. It's not a button or an input type equals button. So I have role equals button. Role is an ARIA thing, and it is what tells screen readers this is supposed to be a button and not just a graphic. Tab index. This is, I briefly touched on it when I was doing NVDA. If you press tab or shift tab in any program, that should move you to the next or previous control, even if you're not using a screen reader. At least on Windows, that's the default behavior. But graphics on the web, by default, are not in the tab order. So if I have, let's say, a button or an image that I want to be a button between two text boxes, I'm in the text box at the top, I hit tab, it skips the image and goes to the text box at the bottom. So this tab index equals 0 will put that into the tab order so that when I tab, it'll say next button and not whatever's after it. And then the source, alt, is short for alternate text, and it is basically the label. I'm sure anyone who's done web stuff has probably read at least something about how images should have alt text. If they're just decoration, set it to an empty string, and screen readers will ignore them completely. But there's all these little things, and then I have an on-click event.
Out of curiosity, do you think you could set up a text parser or script or something like that to look for preset codes like where it says on click?
You could, but inline on-click events like this are kind of rare nowadays. And part of the problem is there really is no way, unless you get into AI stuff and really train the AI to do this, there's really no way to tell what the developer meant to do just by the HTML. Now, if they set role equals button, that's different, and that's obvious. But if it's just a graphic with an on-click event, well, is it a graphic that is supposed to work like a checkbox and changes to a different image? Or is it a graphic that's supposed to be a button? That is, you press it and something else happens, like going to the next slide. And then it gets that much more complicated when you talk divs, because then you have, is it part of a menu bar? Is it part of a dialog? Is it part of a tree view? There's any number of widgets that it could be. And if the ARIA role is not set correctly, there's really no way for assistive tech or even a script like what you're suggesting would know that. But again, I think with AI growing, I definitely think it could be done. But that'd be a massive project.
Could you incorporate something like that into Google Spider, where it basically flags websites as not already accessible?
Ooh. Well, shame on me for not knowing Google Spider. What is Google Spider?
That's what they use to index all those pages.
Okay. Then I will have to Google that.
I'm sure they'll be working on it tomorrow.
Oh, I'm sure.
That'd be kind of fun with the what they have a bunch of docs for. If you don't implement this, then we dock you in the search results. If your page is not mobile responsive, they will dock you in the search results. So if your website isn't accessible, then we'll dock you in the search results. That'd be an easy way to get it done.
Motivator for sure.
It certainly would.
So if I were to try to make a development tool, like for developers, and I wanted to make an accessibility linter, would a good MVP be something that checks for role and alt text in every single tag, and it just simply tells you for all the ones that you don't have it and makes you fill it in before you can build? Would that be a...
Not necessarily. So I have a lot of things here that don't need an ARIA role because they are what they're meant to be. For example, I have a div that is really just a div. It's a container element. I have a H1 here, level 1 heading. That is what a level 1 heading is supposed to be. It's not part of a widget, so there's really no need to redefine what it is. And I think if there were a way to filter out just the ones that have JavaScript event listeners, then maybe that could work.
I see.
But basically the point of ARIA, in a nutshell, is to do what HTML by itself can't do. And that is to provide that additional information to screen readers. So roles, there's also states, which are like checked or not checked, selected, hidden. There's ARIA properties, and there's something ARIA Live will actually tell you whether or not a screen reader should immediately speak content once it changes. All sorts of things you can do with it. But there is obviously a learning curve here, so I definitely like to talk with you guys afterward about maybe working together to create something that could help people starting out.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, for example, I think a lot of the Bootstrap framework functions out of the box come with some sort of ARIA role in them, and I don't know if that's because they're necessary or because Bootstrap just decided to do that with everything.
You're adding in accessibility without even knowing it.
The opposite of what they intended.
Well,
You never know with Bootstrap.
I feel like there should be a button out to be published for like buying people to Bootstrap at the Thanks for saving this shit ton of time.
Bootstrap's actually wasted me more time in my life than it saved me, but that's because we had a designer and product person who wanted to do something that you have to totally rewrite Bootstrap to do.
oh wow. Yeah, anytime you have to rewrite a framework, you may as well just build your own framework. I've not worked with Bootstrap,
eventually convinced them to switch over to the Bourbon framework, which is basically the bare bones, and then you actually write in everything. But I noticed that, like, when you make a modal, for example, in Bootstrap, it puts that as a role, and it sets the tab index to a -1, I think, instead of a 0, because it's not something
-1
that's showing
removes
on the
things from the
screen.
tab order.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it sounds like they're trying, and that's important. Ideally, all the frameworks would do it, but yeah, to answer your question about everything being a div, can that be a problem? Absolutely. I mean, you go to any website where they've done these really cool custom widgets, and screen reader doesn't know what a widget is supposed to be unless you give it a role. A div is a div is a div, and they're all containers. So, and role is just one of many parts to ARIA, but I think it's probably the easiest one to pick up and the most important to remember. But like if the role is checkbox, then there's this ARIA checked. So a graphic cannot be checked or unchecked. But if it's supposed to be a checkbox, then that kind of makes sense. So there's a lot of little things like that would have to be, that to me should be important decisions in building a framework that uses a lot of custom widgets. Custom widgets are great for designers, not so great for screen readers, unless they've got this ARIA stuff down. So I guess short answer is yes, it would be an issue.
Are there any checklists out there for accessibility that are geared toward developers that it's kind of like, did you do this? Did you do this? So that people can
Not so
jog
much
their
a
memory?
did you do this kind of checklist, but the W3C does have a spec, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. And that goes very deep into what the standards are according to W3C. So they cover things like images having alt text. They cover form fields being labeled. You know, you could build a "Did you do XYZ" checklist off of that.
I'm just thinking about the general laziness level of developers, and reading an entire W3C spec is not something most people do.
I totally
But
agree.
reading a bullet point list seems within our capabilities.
If I was going to handle this person, what I'd probably do is I'd approach some not-for-profit organizations about setting up an accessibility task force, and then have them approach the frameworks that are available, published on GitHub and things like that, about incorporating RE standards into the frameworks. That way, they're built in.
Absolutely. And, you know, tonight I'm here as just me. I'm not actually representing the company that I work for, but we do WCAG site evaluation, and it sounds like that would be right up our alley. Of course, I don't know where the headquarters are for the companies behind these frameworks, but I mean, I think that's a great idea. And I really appreciate some of these ideas that have come up about new directions for accessibility and some of these things that we've talked about simply because they're so outside the box from where things are now. I hope that what you guys are talking about will work out that way. Thanks for your suggestions. Yeah, I'd like to talk to you guys after about this. Anyway, do we have any other questions about what I've covered here so far?
No, that was cool. It was also interesting to watch you navigate your code. I know that's something that none of us really have to deal with, and we're not used to. So yeah, seeing that was certainly interesting.
Thanks. Yeah, it's part of my process every day, simply because it's all I do. I've kind of gotten to where, I mean, I'm looking at code. I can zoom in, zoom out as needed. I think for me the biggest challenge here was not zooming in too much, because I know you guys are seeing that all on the screen here.
Well, it's by far the easiest things that we've been able to read as far as code demonstrations.
Well, that's why I made that crack about, hey, these are the shortcuts. If you guys are on a Windows box next time.
Well, and I think in terms of user testing, people have thought of all kinds of outside-the-box things. Like there is a guy who runs an entire consultancy off of testing code while drunk. Because quote, the user is drunk. and I think that there's but I think most companies when they're testing don't necessarily think about users who might be using their site in a way where they're using accessibility. So that's something that
I think a lot of that comes down to the lean design. It really does things. Like people are just trying to get it to work, and then
well, especially coming from startup perspective, where working somewhere where there are only 2 developers total, right? I think this sort of thing where we're having a general checklist where we can at least do better while we're still trying to get everything to work.
it's just a matter of that's just at the end of the day, it's basic good practice, best practice. And unfortunately, that's a very nebulous concept.
Yeah.
It is. But really, I mean, when you set aside all the politics stuff of having to meet deadlines and all that, when you get to the after hours, outside the box stuff, that's why I love going to meetups like Orlando Python. there are so many new ideas, new directions, new things that can come from just sitting and talking with other developers that really kind of help us all think a little more outside the box. And I think, yeah, when you talk about lean design, and I mean, even setting aside some of that, just deadlines, period. I mean, I got a project due in a couple weeks. If there's a couple things that could be better, well, does the software work? Does it do what it's supposed to do? And we kind of become okay with that minimum, to where, okay, I can click this, click that, go here, and it works. If a user does something stupid, it doesn't crash, so it's good to go. And there are some extra steps. I mean, even just thinking about what you said about a checklist of bullet points. A couple of bullet points on my list would be, if you have a checkbox, if you have a custom checkbox, wannabe checkbox, does it have the checkbox role, and does it set ARIA checked? Well, if the answer is no, you have to go back in the code and add those things. And yeah, for one lousy checkbox, that's no big deal, but for an entire app, that might not always fly at work. So,
Yeah, but then, the company that you were talking about is Pizza Hut, and they are serving so many people that
Yep.
they
Literally.
should
Well,
be
yeah.
thinking about that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think, gosh, of all those friends that I told you that were blind programmers or blind techies, not a one of them would turn down a pizza. Myself included.
But you're saying that Pizza Hut's one of those corporations that needs to go and address accessibility on the website?
They've gotten better about it. Their website is constantly changing anyway. And I just noticed last time I got pizza from them, they've gotten a lot better. I mean, there was a time a few months ago, maybe longer, when it was not so hot, but since then their site's changed like 4 times, so they're probably a bad example to check out now because they've fixed a lot of that.
Pizza Hut's not necessarily known for being an easy or nice application to use, either their mobile apps or the website.
Oh, really?
You're right. It has been getting better, but even for the typical user, it's always just been a pain and an eyesore.
Well, and that's why I appreciate you guys inviting me to come down here and share this info, because whatever you're building, you never know if someone is going to want to use it but not be able to use it. Now, there are some things that are, one thing that I did not cover here that I really would have liked to is accessibility versus usability. There are some things that are technically accessible. You can access them. I've seen some forms online that have so many text boxes. You could hit E 80 bazillion times to go to the edit field you're looking for, but it really is not that easy to get to.
That raises an interesting question. What do you think is the maximum length you should pursue before the NVDA just becomes like a nightmare?
The maximum what you should pursue?
Like the length of a form or anything like that?
Depends on the form. I mean, anything important enough that you really can't do without, you could go through a form that long with NVDA. But if you want to go back 10 data points, you have to hit Shift-Tab 10 times, or Shift-E 10 times, or whatever the case may be. And it can be a nightmare. And that's regardless of web, desktop, whatever. And that's where, like I said, it's not an accessibility issue because they can get there. But there's a usability issue in that if they need to get there, they can't get there quickly, or they have a hard time finding things. And that's getting deeper into some of what I heard you guys talking about earlier with UX and the whole user experience concept, which I am far from an expert on. Apart from accessibility, I do a lot of back-end stuff, a lot of, server-side code, a lot of desktop stuff. So beyond accessibility, I'm not sure how that. I think that would be more of something. I guess let me put it to you this way: how many form fields would you want to go through if you had to use NVDA?
Yeah. Well, and now you've got me thinking about LinkedIn and the way that they do their form, where you can drag and drop each section of it, and it changes the whole order. And I'm thinking about what a nightmare that would be for somebody who relies on the order to fill out the form. And they do that to make it easier on everybody else, but what I'm hearing is that like maybe they need to make an entirely different version for people who need accessibility than the one that they're making.
That was my initial thought was if we're looking at it from a conceptually to meet various users, you try to build out this concept in parallel. You have a usability site, and you may have a link in the more featuristic site that says for usability, click this one. Now, yes, that's a streamed down version, so you don't have this numerous tab selection and row selection. I think they can build that, but once again, politics playing too. Well, how long did that take? Well, we got to check this one, we got to clean this one up, and on top of that, balance it against this one. We don't have all that. Cut it to this. That's where that tug of war kind of comes in. And if you have frameworks that already had from the beginning, that kind of alleviates y'all having to stress of building that. So it's a tug of war. I'm a consultant. It's there. I'm glad you mentioned it because I was in Coral Springs, and it's at the Charter High School. And at that school, they're faced with that same challenge. So I'm not a front-end developer. I'm a network engineer on the back end. But I do work with a lot of API and a lot of stuff that's starting to grow out, and I'm starting to get those questions. Well, we want you to change this up. How can we get this from the server to here? I'm looking around like a network guy, like, hey, I just make the highways. I can tell you what's an off-ramp. But that has been a concept that was brought up, and there was a corporate 500, what they call it. It's not hush hush, you probably hear the name. Corporate 500 basically, those Fortune 500 companies, their executives get together, and they're talking about which is called the next curve. And the next curve is what greatly enhances the other, because the last 20 years, it's been all network, build out the infrastructure. Well, now we're wireless, so nobody cares. You don't have to build out infrastructure that already exists because wireless exists. But now people don't have the picture to go with the mobility. I want to be able to do this all from one page. Now, the pressure and onus is now on you to develop a page, quick, agile, accessible, no kinks, no problems, very rapid. That's a lot.
It is.
Or even in the programming. So to go back to my original point is, in the thought process or at the water cooler or the brain talks is, how do we come up with something that we can kind of instantly click? It builds those parallel formats or baselines, and we should add more feature ripping here and keep this with those just meat and potatoes. Is there a way that you can do that now?
That's a really good question. One thing that I do for a lot of my little side projects, I like to write JavaScript functions that will create accessible widgets. So that's what Dojo does. That's what hopefully more of these frameworks are starting to do. Because if you stick to those widgets that are created that way, the accessibility stuff's already done. When you get to talking about two versions of a website or a program, unfortunately, the accessible one usually gets left behind because it is a minority. It is a group of people that there's maybe not as big a market for, whatever the case may be. Back to my buddy's Twitter example, he found something called Chicken Nugget. It was just a third party, not affiliated with Twitter. He just built an accessible Twitter client. And that's great, but what happens if that guy drops that project? You end up with this Twitter client that is old, maybe doesn't even work anymore. And all the time, Twitter goes on adding new features and adding, different things you can do. I mean, anything could go in that direction, even if it were a Twitter employee that had done this. If that guy gets fired and no one's left to take over the project, all kinds of stuff that can happen. Where the accessible version, this was actually what you're suggesting is kind of used to be a common thing for websites that you used to have. In fact, there used to be a standard out there. I believe it still is in Section 508, which is a government a standard for federal websites. Used to be a standard saying that a text-only version of the page is available if you can't meet the standards with your regular website. And companies were doing that too, but we were finding that the accessible versions were not keeping up with, they were not equivalent to the full version, which, I don't know, I mean, to me personally, I would much rather get on an accessible version of LinkedIn if I knew it was going to be kept up. Thankfully, in my situation, I can just crank up the Zoom and use LinkedIn as is, but for a screen reader user, maybe not so easy.
Is that a part of do you know if that's a part of the W3C standard at all? Things that have parts that move and accessibility, like in terms of like click and drag operations?
I don't think so, but I'm sure they have. I've been over those standards I don't know how many times. I don't think there's anything that addresses click and drag specifically, but they have standards like if an element can be entered with the keyboard, it can be exited with the keyboard. All content is operable from the keyboard interface. I don't think there's one that goes into click and drag specifically, but there are standards that would cover it, I think.
Anything else?
Well, then, like I said, thanks for your time, thanks for your attention, and thanks for all the awesome questions, because you do give me some ideas for projects just talking to you. I'd like to get your 2 cents on some stuff afterward. So if there's nothing else, that's it. Thanks, guys.
That was cool. That was definitely the most
Windows default lock screen, window lock screen.
definitely the most question-heavy thing I think we've had in a very long time.
Yeah, I think
It's very interesting.
sometimes having a smaller ratio of attendees promotes a better discussions and having a packed room where people are more nervous to speak up in front of.
Yeah, and believe me, I totally get that, because I go to some of the other meetups here, and they're awesome. I was at ODevs last week, and huge crowd, awesome topics. But I mean, if they didn't need lightning talks, I would not have gone up there.
ODevs is the definition of a packed room.
Yes.
Yes, it is. Even the data science related ones that we had in here, those were definitely packed as smaller room, less people, but it's still, no one wants to raise their hand and ask a question because there's more people who might raise their hand and ask a question.
Yeah, I had a question that ODevs once, and instead of bugging him in the middle of his presentation, I went and talked to him afterward. I mean, me, I don't care. I really appreciate that we've been talking back and forth. And like I said, you guys came up with some ideas that I'd really like to explore a bit further, simply because they're so different from my day-to-day work of working around programs that are not accessible and trying to make them accessible. some of the stuff like, Twitter, LinkedIn, all that, they have APIs. That's to me it seems like they need almost like a. Actually, I had that friend of mine that I was telling you about who found Chicken Nugget had this really cool idea of creating a site that would offer a whole bunch of accessible versions of software, or accessible software for people who couldn't use or wouldn't use the regular ones.
Is there a reason why he chose to call his program Chicken Nugget?
I think he just called it that because I don't know.
He was hungry.
He must have been hungry. I mean, yes.
I was wondering if it had anything at all to do with the olden days of Twitter, something I wasn't aware of.
Yeah,
Because-
my first thought was he was expressing what he really thought of Twitter, but I don't know.
Because right now your default icon is an egg, which is food related, but that's as close as I can get to Twitter plus chicken nuggets.
Would you say that there's any rock stars with accessibility?
Dave. No. No, I'm kidding. As far as individual developers, not really. I mean, none that I know of. I'm sure they're out there, but
Or even just champions of it? Like, there have been TEDx or anything like that. TED Talk on it?
I'm not sure on that one. I'll have to check it out. See what. I have to Google it, like I said earlier, because I'm not sure who the main players are in that. But it is becoming a thing for, it's more than just a buzzword or a fad. It is actually being recognized, and I think soon we will see, like you said, champions or rock stars or what have you of accessibility. Just because it's not going anywhere, as long as there's people who want to use software but can't, there's going to be guys like me trying to make it work.
So sorry, I wasn't laughing.
No,
The
no.
screen behind you turned into like forever screens.
Yeah, this is.
So my
I'm still playing
apologies.
around with
No,
this.
that's awesome. Forever screens, huh?
Yeah.
I'm one of those people who has trouble talking during talks, but I do have a question about how usually you see some kind of service that would go through and grade a website based on. I know Google has a legal document grade based on your rights, and when you sign click here to use this service, you agree to our terms and services. There are plugins that will rate the website and service based on how well or poorly they treat those users that agree. So is there any kind of similar plugins that, hey, this is a really low accessibility, you might want to put some time into it, or this is a B, keep working, there's some better things
I
to
haven't
do.
seen one that assigns a grade like that, but in Google Chrome, there's under audits, there's an accessibility tool you can get to add that. There's also a tool called AXE, A-X-E. I don't know where they got, I guess, AXE, accessibility. There are all kinds of tools out there to let developers know where their code doesn't meet certain standards. The one I mentioned, achecker.ca, is one of my favorites because it can check against multiple standards. It can do WCAG, it can do Section 508, which is the government one. It can do some other weird standards that I think are just out of Italy or something. And it's free. Just paste into the URL and it'll let you know.
I think your great idea could be really good for top traffic websites.
Oh,
To have an organization that scores specifically those that people really, everybody's on them and they really should have the resources to be fully accessible. Because, for example, the Human Rights Campaign, they do that with, Fortune 500 companies, and it's put a lot of pressure on those companies. They want that 100 score, right, for human rights. And so to do something like that for accessibility, for the Twitters out there and the websites that have like a really large user base or a really high Alexa ranking, I think would probably yield a lot of revenue.
Amazon's bought Alexa, and there was a guy who did the presentation here. He's the head of Amazon Web Services. Probably about a year ago, or it was February, March of 2016. He would be somebody that I would contact about asking about who to contact in Amazon about having Alexa put that information.
That's a really cool idea. You guys must be connected. I'll tell you, if I could do half the things that I want to do when I come back from these meetups, shoot, I would have. I'd say I'd do nothing else but code, but that's kind of the case already. But no, I agree. I think if you had, for at least for all those top sites that everyone's on, like Amazon or Facebook or whatever, those big companies, they would want that A grade or 100 score, 5 stars or whatever. I think that's an awesome idea.
So I guess that's going to come to me. We have 25 minutes to get out of here, so I'll make this quick. But don't pipe up if you have a question or anything. I have 10 items in here that are kind of cool, and the first couple are actually new as of Python 3.6. The red line that you see there is my linter, not knowing that my linter is still 3.5, so it's giving me a little error there. But 3.6 came out in December, and it's going to be it's supposed to be pushed into the Anaconda pipeline by the end of this month, so I guess fingers crossed there. But you can set up a new environment either through Anaconda or virtualenv to use Python 3.6, and that's what I'm going to be using for this presentation to show you the new things. The first thing is 10 tips and tricks I have for you is remember to use your string formatting. I'm sure we've done a little bit of string formatting. It's you get a string, you give it the curly braces, and then after it you do .format to either include your expressions, your variable names, but it can also do a bit of formatting. So the first thing I have is crazy number 13 divided by 11. It's going to give me a bunch of repeating digits in a floating point number. And I'm just going to print it out. It's going to print the integer, but then what it's also going to do is it's going to use the string formatting to round the printout to 3 decimal places. And before I talk about the next part, I'll just I'll give you a preview, but I have it set up here where I can just type in the code block that I want to run. I can show that at the bottom later on.
Sorry to jump, but just out of curiosity, do you update for was it bash bug or what was that huge bash?
Oh, so the bash in there. How to pull up the window?
No. Like there was a huge security flaw in bash where you could like change environmental variables by just setting it string. Do you update for that?
I'm not a bash. This is just the bash as part of the Mac OS. So hopefully they fixed it. If not, then Macs have a kind of a problem. But I guess everyone see the bottom in the back there? So we print out the long repeating string, and by default it rounds whatever the last thing is. But the next one down there is instead of 1.18181, it's rounding to our 3rd decimal place there. And just a little bit of a preview. What's new in Python 3.6 is you were able to use called a formatted string. If you're familiar with binary or raw, you put a B or an R in front of the actual string value. In 3.6 they've added F for formatted string, and without giving a dot format at the end of the string, you can include expressions and variable names instead of having to do dot format. It's supposed to shorten the line up quite a bit. And in the bottom down here, you say, hello there, Michael, and I just did that by referencing the variable name. Other languages have that functionality, and it's nice to see it coming to Python. Another thing that they added in is the ability to put underscores in decimal or numerics of any kind. Because the comma is a reserved character in the Python language, except when it's being used in a string, they instead are using underscores as to separate out these numbers. So the two print statements we have here, we're printing out some, if anyone wants to figure that out, say a trillion. I believe septillion? No, quintillion. Yeah. And you wouldn't, and obviously this is a little bit more readable because you can see that it's going to be one of something, quintillion, and you can't quite see that with here. So this doesn't actually have anything to do with the functionality of your code, but it greatly helps readability when you're working with large numbers. Another way that you can also do that is 10e, I guess in this case, 18, 10e18 is also going to give you the exact same value, or 10e17, 1e18. But it also works with binary and hex values. So this 0x is, I'm going to, we use that to prefix hex values, and 0b for binary values. There's a couple of other ones that it also works with, but it will work for those. And the other thing is that if you want to print it out, print out these large numbers with these underscores here, we use our string formatting to have our braces, colon, which signals that we're going to do some kind of value formatting, and we're just going to use an underscore. And it's by default just an underscore is going to put it every 3. Doing underscore b, underscore x, whatever, the same kind of things that we did up here with these hex and binary flags are going to separate it every 4. So if I run,
How did you come up with the instruction for every 3? What determined that?
So for every to insert it automatically for this number every 3, it's inside of our curly braces, we have this colon, which tells the format that we're going to change some value. And they, with 3.6, they added in a new configuration flag in there, the underscore, which is going to insert an underscore every 3, or an underscore with one of our other numeric flags is going to insert it every 4.
So that's not flexible.
That's hard coded. Yeah, that's static. It's just like doing your your time string formatting. There's a set way to format your string with the different variables that they give you. So I'll run this code, block number or index 1. So we printed out our same values, even though one is much more readable. With this hex value, this is the number that we get. Same here, down here with the binary value. And then we print out the same one and our binary value, but it's gone ahead and inserted the underscores in our printout. And note that it's still going to get rid of any leading zeros. So our binary here had a leading 0. It got rid of our leading 0 there. Next one. I've gone over this before, but this is always a great thing to remember how to use. And it is making your custom classes work with the with statement. I have here as little code as you need to do a class, which is class with example, and then defined at least one function. With actually requires two functions, so this is a class that contains nothing except for the code necessary to be used in a with function. And that's an enter value where it returns self, and an exit value which we just have it printing a value and returning nothing. And the exit, actually, this star underscore, this is a Pythonic way to say I'm going to ignore all inputs. Exit gets three different variables that are used for error handling, but we're not doing any of that here, so we're just going to ignore it. Then the actual with statement, we can do with initialize as variable, and we're just going to print out the default description for our variable here, and we're going to print inside. And what we should see is in the printout, we're going to see enter, printout our descriptor, print inside, and then print exit as it loops out of this code. Another thing to note about the with statement is that if we're not actually going to use the object, we don't have to include as variable name, although in this case, because we're printing out the description, that would actually fail. But that's something that you can do as well. So I'll go ahead and run this block. So we get enter, our class descriptor, inside, and then exit. I went over a more in-depth example with the with statement before, and all that code is on the our GitHub page. The next one that's really useful that they introduced with Python 3 is a much easier way to print out data to files, and that's using the print statement. So this is our normal print statement where it's just going to print something to the console. Another way that we have to send data out to, a way that we have to send data out to a file is by writing it directly to a file object. And here I'm actually using the with statement so that the file object actually has the enter return self, and then on exit it will actually call self.close. So instead of doing open, faut equals open, do something, faut.close, that's taken care of automatically for you, and faut is actually deleted as a variable name. But we have faut.write, it's going to write to a file. But the thing that they introduced in Python 3 is they gave us a new flag inside the print statement where we can specify file equals a file object that we open. And in this case, I'm actually going to, this is going to append to this exact same file, test.txt. So let's run this one. It's going to be block 3. And we get, oh, in case you, I forgot to mention this, my little block, I'm actually printing out the description for each of these functions that I'm running, and I'll show that at the bottom as well. But inside, we use 2 print statements and a file write, and we have one print statement here, prints to the console. But we also have test.txt, which writes to file, and then our print statement prints to file append. And it's a shorter way and is a little bit more robust in terms of automatically taking all of your objects and turning them into strings and then printing out.
So you don't have to worry about closing anything, that sort of print statement.
Yeah. It takes care of everything for you. It's a really nice addition. Next, and this is another thing that was also introduced with Python 3, but they have a new addition to annotations in Python 3.6. Python itself is not a strongly typed language. It's a loosely typed language, which means that we can say my int, we can give it an int value, and then later on we can say my int equals string ABCDE, and it doesn't really care. It's very useful to have stuff like that in a lot of situations, but it's also a bit harder on the programmer unless they do a lot of inline documentation. Something that they added with Python 3 were function annotations, which I'll get to towards the bottom of this, but they just introduced variable annotations like in other languages. The simplest example is going to be this myInt : int, and a normal introduction is going to be something like that, which I have up here. This myInts : list int is the official way to do things like saying I have a list of integers, and we give it a list of integers. This way down here, myInt int is similar to other languages.
Traditional, how they do it in like functional type.
Yeah, and but yes, and that's exactly the case. In another language, we might see myInt int, and myInt now is declared in the scope, and we can only assign integer values to it later on. That's actually not the case with Python, even though that's how it is. For a programming perspective, we can declare myInt int, but the code doesn't care about that. So if we tried to do myInt : int without applying anything to it, without giving it an actual value, and we tried to print myInt, it's not only just going to give us an error, could not find value, it's going to give us a reference before assignment error, which means that even though we've said I have a variable called myInt and it's going to be of type int, because Python doesn't care about annotations as far as being strongly typed, it doesn't even see that as being entered into declared. It doesn't see it as a variable yet, and it doesn't happen until we actually assign it a value. So they're doing all these things to make Python more readable, especially if you look at your own code, or more importantly, if other people come and look at your code later on. But they're not enforcing it. Functionally, other than just being easier to read, they're doing this so that IDEs like PyCharm can give you more information and do some pre-compile optimization of your code. Because if they know that you're declaring this to be an int, and they can start looking for, well, they told me it's an int, okay, I've seen an int, they can go ahead and pre-optimize your code, or more importantly, the documentation, all the linting for that. But it doesn't enforce it. Python doesn't enforce any of these.
So if you add these in optionally, Python is not actually going to check that you did what you said you did.
Exactly. Python doesn't care. There are
IDEs are going to add that to how they're throwing errors.
Python IDEs already are. PyCharm with PyCharm had support for them out of the gate when they released Python 3. VS Code with the Python plugin has started. The libraries that it uses have already started to take those into account. So if I come down here to this function annotation, maybe hopefully, well, yeah, it's still looking for 3.5, and it's that the 3.6 stuff is screwing it up. But it gives you those little tooltip windows, and it has all of the annotations in there for you. So it's at this point, unless you specifically pull in a type checking library that enforces strong typing onto Python, at this point it's really just for readability and IDEs.
So do you know what the reasoning was behind having this option of inline type annotation? Because I haven't seen other languages do that. Doesn't mean there aren't any, just I haven't seen any like that.
Yes, I know. As I was reading through the PEP, the proposal for adding those in, and their examples were specifically for things like for class variables. So in a class, if you're not, no, that's terrible. like let's say my var is a class variable, and you're just going to assign it later on, you can either give it an initial value that you intend to overwrite later on, or if you know that my var is going to be a dict, but you don't know what that dict is, rather than giving it an empty dictionary, a lot of people will just do that. So they'll just initialize it none. But unless you do, will be a dict value in a comment above it, someone who's coming across the code who doesn't read intently into your code isn't going to know what that's going to be. So that PEP was specifically to cover, well, I can say my var equals none, or I can do dict where the keys are strings and the values are ints. And that's at least a little bit more readable. So you're saying that this is what it's going to be, and I'm giving it a none value to start off with because that's how my code is set up. So that specific, that was one of the strongest use cases that I saw in the PEP. Anyway, continuing down this, it's the same thing. I can say that, there we go. I can say that I have a dictionary where I give it strings and ints, and I set it to be a dictionary. But I can come back and say, I could say my dict equals none, or I could say, in this case, my dict key is a float value equals none, and it doesn't care. It does. These type annotations are not enforced by standard lib Python. Now, what they did have starting with 3.0 were function annotations, and I advocate using these like crazy because they increase readability so much. So def foo bar, without even knowing it, is without reading any further, you can say, well, bar is going to be a string type. And maybe here stew, we can give string descriptions in addition to just objects. And this is could be an int or none, and we still give it an initial value of none. And it also has support for return types using this arrow, the hyphen close arrow. So we know that the return is going to be a dictionary where the keys are strings and the values are lists of strings. So and also using this inline value here. So val equals a list of strings, and we go ahead and create that using this single line if statement, if else statement, and then return. And then there's print statements here. The first one is here's what we're feeding in, and we're going to get the value out of that. The other one is all of these annotations, at least for function annotations, are stored in function name dot underscore underscore annotations underscore underscore, and that's how all these IDEs get these values out. But they're also accessible to the developer in case you want to read them. So running this code block, I didn't have any of these in print statements, but this our foo function here. We have foo high, and for is returning high, and then a list of 4 highs in there. And our annotations is a dictionary where the variable name is the key, and then either the object description, as seen here in bar, is given, or the annotation description is set for the value like it is here with stew. And then return, I would actually be kind of fun to play with, because return is a, oh yeah, never mind. Return is a reserved name, so we couldn't name something return. But that's where that's given.
So for functions, is that the only way that you can do annotation is like inside the actual arguments of it?
Yes. There are ways that you can make it look nicer. The begins library is actually a great example of how to use function annotations for a better purpose. They actually I've covered it before, but they use the function annotations to generate the help string when you are creating a Here, actually, I'll scroll down to that right now because I'm using begin down here, and so this is supposed to replace the if name equals main argument in Python, and I give it a variable name here, code block, and then a string description of what this variable is. And if I, oh, there's that working. If I do, instead of doing tips and tricks, I can do -h to bring up the help documentation. And it brings up general usage. Here's how you use it. Here's my variable name. Here's our function description, as seen in here. And then our positional arguments and optional arguments. It gives me my variable name and then the annotation string that you see appear, which describes what it's supposed to be doing in the help doc. This is an example of a library that's using function annotations for to make a programmer's life really easy and a user's life really easy at the same time. So continuing, seeing how much I can actually get done of this tonight. So
You can always save some for the
Yeah.
next meeting as well.
that is true. I'll have all of this code available for anyone who wants to peruse it after the meetup, available on the GitHub page. I think if there's one thing in here that I can do really quickly that is of good use is these equals. So Python is really flexible in how you can use object values being evaluated inside of if statements. So you can kind of think of an if statement as being if Boolean value of some object, because this is how all of your if statements get evaluated if they're not already Boolean values. And what that allows us to do is create things like this, where if some given string either go into the if statement or not. Same thing with this down here. We can give it a list, and it can use that as opposed to if Boolean. If in other languages you might do if my list dot is empty, but in Python we can just do if my list. And the general cheat shortcut for remembering how it can get evaluated is if your object is empty, it's evaluated to false. If your object is not empty, it's evaluated to true. And unless you're working with numerics, that's going to cover most cases. So these objects here are all evaluated to be true. So if true, 1, -1, 2.34, a string with foo in it, a list with integers, or a dictionary with at least one key value pair, all get evaluated to be true when used in an if statement. All these values here, so false, none, 0, 0.0, an empty string, an empty list, or an empty dictionary, all get evaluated to false. And in case you're not quite familiar with binary gates, this if true and is only going to actually go into this if statement if every one of these are true, and this if not value or is going to go into the if statement only if all of them are false. This if not brackets or is the same as doing if not value and if not value and not value and not value. There's a shortcut for doing that mathematically. So I can just run this and just show you that it works. But when people are just starting out, it's one of the things that people don't realize from other languages that Python is really flexible about. So all of those were true, all of those were false. This goes ahead and prints both of these statements because we have a non-empty string, and if not empty list prints it out. So I think I got to half of my 10, but that's okay. I can all this will be available later on. Just kind of give you a preview of the other ones. Here's how to make a decorator. If you're not familiar with those these are if you've seen these little @ signs, what they do is they take in a function and they either wrap around or they change how the function gets used. They're great for Flask uses them a ton, but there are other times that you can use them. How to make a dictionary from 2 different lists. This dict zip and then list of keys, list of values is really great. I'm not having to search down here to show you that's true. Memoization, the idea that if it takes a long time to grab a value, wouldn't you just like to be able to save that value so that you can get it later on? And you can save yourself a lot of time, especially if you're looking up values using web calls multiple times. You can save yourself a lot of time. And then this other this pooling thing down here. If let's say I have to go out and get the values from 10 different API calls, and then I'm not going to do anything until all of those are done, I can either do that sequentially, or I can use pooling and do them n number at a time. And then once all of them are done, continue working on my code. So I can I'll have these up there later on, and they're great things to know how to use. But other than that, we are out of time. 9:03.
For the type annotations, can you use any types? Is that available?
Yes. For the type annotations, you can either give it a string, and you can put whatever you want in a string, or you can put anything that can be evaluated as an object. So if I
That's not exactly what I meant. Like in a functional language, you could say like, I want to have a list and use like brackets for list, right?
Mhm.
And have a as the type, meaning it could be any type of list, and then you could use an arrow and say, but what I'm going to get back is a list of type B, meaning that will be another list of any type that's not the first one.
I know it supports the first one. One of the peculiarities, but one of the things in Python is that absolutely everything in the language is an object. So if you didn't know what type it was going to return, but you still wanted to use a hard typed, a strongly typed library for enforcement, it's not the same as other languages where you say in Swift you do is type T, where all of the objects returned are of the same type, but we don't know what the type is. There's not a similar thing in Python just because it's not strongly typed, but because everything is an object, you can say that I'm going to return a dictionary where the keys are of type string and the return is object. That would pass because everything is an object. And if you actually want to say I'm going to return a JSON compatible dictionary, this would actually be the way to do it. So I think that's as close as function annotations can get to answering that question.
Yeah, I think so. I think it seems like you technically, because it's not actually enforcing it, you could write something that would indicate like, I want a list of type A or whatever, and I want to make sure that the thing that gets returned is also of type A, right? But it wouldn't work if you were also using something that attempts to check the types on top of it, like PyCharm or something like that.
Yeah, I know because function annotations have been around long enough. Well, most fully fledged IDEs will do this. Even Pylint, which can be installed and used either on its own or integrated with IDEs, like it is with VS Code via the Python extension, it will give you errors if it sees that my var equals 1 and then you change it to my var equals none. It will say, hey, I don't think did you mean to change the variable's value type, or was that an accident? Did you not know what it was? And they are getting a little bit smarter where they're looking at these function return types. So if you say a function is going to return an int, and when you call that function it returns a tuple, it's going to say, hey, this function isn't right. This is not doing what you said it was going to do. And they are getting better about that, and they've been able to do this kind of, you've changed the type of this variable for a while, but it's still there. It's still loosely typed. The language itself is not enforcing any of these. And the earliest time that they would do it, if they decide, if the community decides to do that, would be Python 4.
I just have I'm like doing a comparison in my head to Elm and Haskell and stuff that I've been into lately. Because it's neat to me that this exists now in Python, but it's used pretty differently from how functional languages do.
Yeah, at this for the foreseeable future, it really is just there to improve readability and assist IDEs.
Yeah, I think the choice for how you annotate the functions is actually really interesting because the exact reason that people say that having something like Java be strongly typed actually makes it less readable is because of it forcing that sort of inline pattern. And what most of the functional languages are doing differently is you would have your function type annotation right above that would have foo, and then it would have string, arrow, none, arrow, return,
As another, if you have a lot of them and you still want to include them, you can put them on multiple lines because Python knows how to interpret stuff like that. So this is a completely valid way to give yourself some more room and make it look a little nicer.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, that was one of the things that struck me because I used to develop in C++, right? And the strong typing of it actually just hindered readability everywhere. And this seems somewhere in between what functional languages are doing and what like strongly typed object-oriented languages have been doing in the past.
For Python's annotations, I compare them strongly to what Swift has in their language. They even use this exact same arrow.
Well, the arrow is common to all the functional languages as well, but the arrow is used sometimes in more than just type annotations. And the reason it is the arrow is like you actually have an arrow in between each argument because a lot of the way these languages work, everything is auto-curried. So there's no such real thing as a two-parameter function. Like you made a two-parameter function, but that's not how it's actually working under the hood. It's you have your parameter, you return this partially applied function, then you have another parameter and you return until eventually you have value, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
If you don't mind me asking, when you say an arrow, what exactly do you?
Oh, it's using a hyphen, and then a close angle bracket.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's an arrow and two characters.
It's always just been dash greater.
Well, yeah, it is. Yeah, it is dash greater.
I never. Okay, that's cute. I would not.
Yeah. And yeah, that's
I
what
would
it's
not have
using.
guessed that's what they were shooting for was an arrow. So now I kind of get what you guys are talking about here. Back in the conversation. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've done a lot of C++ stuff lately too.
Turn this off.
I'm actually starting
I don't know.
working
Much as I love